Hello there. Now, while I know, obviously, the bulk of people who watch this channel are probably more interested in the ancient history and that sort of thing, and I'll keep on doing plenty of that, I also want to talk about the other periods that I have an interest in and that I've written about, if only in fiction. And particularly as this year we're still in the 80th year after D-Day and the Battle for Normandy, and even though all the commemorations happened back in June and things have moved on, nevertheless, 80 years ago, the Battle of Normandy was still raging throughout July and well into August. So I want to talk again about Hill 112, and I thought I'd begin a series of talks where I try and look at the perspectives of the three main characters, what sort of war we're describing and how I went about trying to approach that. And in each case I'll probably read a little bit from the novel because give a flavour for those who haven't looked at it yet as to how I go about things. Now I've been slightly surprised looking back at this at just how difficult it is to find a passage without quite a lot of swearing in. I did that because I wanted to represent soldiers speaking as I believe soldiers did back in 1944, and the style of it all, including the swearing, is trying to how people spoke then rather than how they speak now, because a lot of modern dramas in particular tend to be rather anachronistic in that respect. But also this is YouTube, this is a channel meant to be accessible to anybody, so and as someone who doesn't swear a lot myself, or tries not to, though I can't always live up to these high expectations and high standards, it was just a reminder, it was the way things were spaced out, trying to find passages that I felt I could read clearly without any trouble were few and far between, as I was looking for something that also illustrated the topics I want to talk about. So anyway, that's interesting, and I will also warn you that while I'm happy chatting like this, which is why I do the talks this way, I'm not someone who's very good at being scripted. I'm not someone who's particularly good at reading things out. So for those of you who prefer audiobooks and all that sort of thing, there is a proper one done by a tried and true and trusted actor who does it far better than I ever could. So anyway, that's the introduction. But today I thought we'd look at James Taylor there, who's in the book from the start, who lands on D-Day, though not on in the first wave, and commands a troop of Sherman tanks. So we're going to look at James's war. We're going to look at commanding a troop of Shermans in Normandy in 1944. So let's start with a passage, and forgive me now, as I say, if I stumble. I'm doing this off the cuff. I'm not sort of rehearsing or anything like that. So we are from 1050 hours on Hill 112, so this is quite some way into the book. Infantry from the Rifle Brigade had taken the orchard, helped by a barrage from the field artillery and supporting fire from the 165th. B Squadron was sent forward on their right to help them hold it. "Driver, take it gently," James said. "Easy, easy, halt." The Firefly lurched to a stop. From the open hatch he had a grand view across the top of the wide hill and far beyond. The training manuals taught that the best position for a tank was to be hull down, which meant that to the front only the turret should be visible. Then the tank could engage the enemy with its main armament, while offering the smallest possible target to return fire. Hull down meant that the hull was hidden behind the crest, which was straightforward when there was an easily defined crest, or the bank of a bocage hedge or a wall of suitable size. The high ground around point 112 curved only gently, which meant that it was very hard to know what a distant enemy gunner would be able to see and what he would not. Dove and Bell brought their Shermans to a halt on either side of him, roughly level, which suggested their judgment was the same as his. "3 Baker to Baker 3, I see dust trails, 10 o'clock, about 500 or 600 yards, over." "I see them, 3 Baker." James licked his lips. The chemicals from the smoke bomb had made them even drier than usual. "Gunner, traverse left, on. Something moving there. Load AP. "Already have, sir." Ahead of the dust trails, 3 tanks came rolling through the high grass. They had flat plates around their turrets, and 2 had big squared side plates on either side of the hull. The other must have lost them, for its hull was visible. They were Mark IVs and were trying to come at the orchard from the flank. "Gunner, target closest tank, range 550 yards. Fire when ready." James blinked before the savage flash shot out of the muzzle and the tank rocked back with the recoil. Both Dove and Bell were shooting, as was Keith's 2 troop to their right. For the moment, the rest of the squadron could not see the enemy. The leading panzer seemed almost to stagger, lurching to one side as several shots slammed home. Its turret began to turn towards them, until another shot struck it. Black smoke poured from the engine covers as the crew jumped down. The next tank was hit. A big chunk of the turret plate ripped off and flung into the air. It started to reverse. The third one already gone, perhaps hit but still driving and vanishing behind the fold from which it appeared. The other one, the one hit in the turret, also vanished, but it was trailing a lot of smoke. To James's right, one of 2 troop Shermans exploded, turret flying high into the air before it dropped. Another shuddered as it was hit and began to burn, the crew spilling out to hide them in the long grass. Baker 2 to all stations. Have lost rest of troop. Think the so-and-so is over there. At 1 o'clock. Range 2000 yards. Am engaging. James scanned the direction with his binoculars. He thought he saw a flash. Gunner, traverse right. Range 2,000 yards, halfway along that line of trees. That's it. On. Baker 3, Able and Baker, watch my shot. Good God, I'm hit, Keith announced with what sounded like mild surprise. I'm bailing out. Fire, James called, realised that he was shouting and closed his eyes just in time. The big gun thundered, the shot slicing through the air. 17-pounders were powerful, but he had heard that their accuracy trailed off at such long ranges. Still, if it did hit, it was still a big shell going damned fast that would spoil anyone's day. A solid shot punched through the air between his tank and Bell's. Driver, reverse. 3 Able and Baker, reverse 30 yards. Corporal Bell's Sherman was struck so hard that it shook, and James expected it to brew. There was smoke and dust everywhere, and when it cleared, the tank was still going. By some freakish chance, the shell had landed on the gun barrel, ripping it in two and leaving jagged shards at the end of a sawn-off stump. Are you all right, 3 Baker? Hell of a headache, Baker replied, and Pearson's out cold. That was his gunner. Everything else is still working. Get back, 3 Baker. You're no more use up here. So that's a small sample, and I've tried to give a flavour of tank warfare in the conditions in Normandy, which weren't the same as conditions elsewhere. There are some aspects in common with armoured warfare throughout the Second World War or even in the West, but also variations. The British Army in Normandy would encounter far more German tanks than it ever would again. Right, I'm just going to switch my glasses because I had the reading ones on for reading, logically enough, but to make sure that I can see the monitor screen of the camera so that I can check things and switch on and off and also realise if anything's gone horribly wrong, I require these distance glasses. So that shows how split a personality I have when it comes to spectacles. Tank fighting tank in most of the Second World War was actually comparatively rare, and there is a tendency, in this case we've had an encounter where James' troop of Shermans plus others on either side, all part of B Squadron, have spotted some Germans trying to advance and get close without being seen. They're in Panzer IVs, the Mark IV tank, long barrel 75, a bit more powerful than a Sherman's gun in terms of armoured piercing. The armour's not that much different. The closest thing to an equivalent that the Allies would encounter, the British, Americans and Canadians, for one of their Shermans. The Panzer IV has some advantages in terms of its gun's a bit more powerful, but beyond that it's not so very different. When you came to the Panthers, the Tigers, these were substantially heavier tanks in terms of they were much better protected with defensive armour, and their guns were far more powerful, so that they could knock out a Sherman at very long range when the Sherman couldn't knock them out until it got very, very close, and often required a little bit of luck and faith as well. So tank encounters figure heavily in the book because they did for many of the British troops in Normandy, and particularly for those from Juno and Gold Beaches, where this was the area most favourable for German armoured counterattacks, so it was where they kept on trying to push through to the beaches, and it was also in turn most favourable for the Allies to advance against them. So a lot of armoured units, a lot of tank units came up against German tanks and panzers a lot of the time and had repeated encounters with German tanks that were never less than your equal and often better than you in terms of individual power and defensive strength. There's all sorts of other issues about their reliability, the number you could manufacture, all that sort of thing. But that's fine and that's important and that's significant, but it doesn't matter. It's not your first priority when you're actually face to face with them in a combat situation. It doesn't matter that Tigers are notoriously unreliable, difficult to manufacture, very difficult to move, they're too wide or too heavy for a lot of bridges, all this sort of thing. The Germans haven't got very many of them. If they happen, some of the ones they have got happen to be facing you. That's your concern. But it's tank warfare was in fact much more what you were trained to do, and what they found themselves doing quite often in Normandy and increasingly in the rest of the campaign in Western Europe was infantry support, where what they were actually doing was, in the main, because the Allies were overall on the offensive, therefore more often than not you were attacking, although sometimes you'd be defending against German counterattacks, you were trying to get the infantry and help them as they advanced to take a position. And this was all about the attributes the tank needs at this point are rather different. So the basic Sherman with its 75mm gun had a very good high explosive round, something that explodes, spreads shrapnel around, and through the shrapnel and the blast can take out, knock down structures, but mainly it's to do with trying to kill, deafen or stun people. When you're fighting against infantry defenders and you're helping your own infantry, that's the most important thing you're doing. That's what you're looking for. And the big threats to you are less likely to be the German tanks, though you might get some assault guns, self-propelled guns, that sort of thing. But it's going to be anti-tank guns that will be dug in, that'll be hard to see, and handheld anti-tank weapons, the Panzerfaust, the Panzerschreck. So you're looking for different things. You're trying to find these things and spot them and shoot them, take them out before they can do the same to you. So there are aspects of tank warfare. We often focus in a sort of top trumps, who's got the best armour sort of thing, who's got the best gun approach on tank against tank. And it was a peculiarity of the Normandy campaign, particularly on the British front and Canadian front, that there was a lot of tank-to-tank encounters. There were far, far fewer on the American front. It was not good tank country, and that was true for the Germans as well as for the Americans. So there, the armoured crews were very much doing infantry support nearly all the time, and occasionally would encounter and have to face off and defeat German armour. With the British and Canadians, that was much more common. So they had to do far more of that, but they're still also doing the infantry support. Now, there's all sorts of things about how the British Army in particular designs its different units and structures them, and the different tanks like the Churchill and this sort of thing, that were the idea that some units were specifically tasked with infantry support, some were building on from the tradition of the cruiser tanks in the pre-war and early war. They were for breakthrough, they were for exploitation, all this sort of thing. In most cases, everybody found themselves doing a bit of everything, because of the nature of this attritional campaign that's fought over a very limited area. The breakout takes a long, long time to occur, and it's more about moving forward, pushing forward, taking the next line, then the next line, and the next line. Now, James is a troop commander in a regiment, a fictional regiment, the 165th RAC, broadly based on the 24th Lancers in reality, who were disbanded during the course of the Normandy campaign as the British Army started to run out of manpower, of the 8th Armoured Brigade that had Dragoon Guards and the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry as well. And there's a lot of very good stuff written about them. They get to see a lot of, even though they're an independent armoured brigade with a small infantry contingent with them, just one battalion with the brigade, that are tasked with, they're attached to infantry divisions to give them some armoured clout, rather than an armoured division like the 11th, the 7th, the Guards, or the Poles and Canadians. They find themselves doing an awful lot of tank-to-tank fighting during this campaign. So that is reflected in the story, and for that particular bit I read, the first time they're on Hill 112 as part of Operation Epsom, I've actually switched them. What they do then is based around the 23rd Hussars that were part of the 11th Armoured Division, just because I wanted to write about those things and prepare the way story-wise for when all our characters are on Hill 112 in the sort of the last big set piece of the book itself. So James commands a troop that's the basic tactical unit of an armoured formation. You have 3 squadrons within an armoured regiment, A, B and C, and each of those has 4, or in some cases 5 troops of tanks, plus there's an HQ element. Traditionally, up until 1944, the British Army organised its tanks in troops of 3, and this was the pre-war doctrine that continued right the way through. And it continued in Normandy for the Churchill tank units, because they didn't have an equivalent of the Firefly. The Firefly, and in this particular episode, James finds himself in the cupola, in the turret of a Sherman Firefly rather than an ordinary 75mm Sherman, was an innovation. This was new. It's the first time it saw service was in Normandy, and many units had only received them in the weeks and months immediately before the invasion. They hadn't had a lot of experience with them, and the doctrine varied as to how you were to use them. So up until this point, every troop of tanks in the British Army consisted of 3 tanks, and you would have one commanded by an officer, normally a lieutenant or second lieutenant. Some regiments, particularly early on, you'd have second captains and people like that commanding a troop as well. And you would then have another tank commanded by a sergeant, and the third one was by the troop corporal. So you had officer, senior NCO, more junior NCO, each in command of a tank. Tank crews were normally around the 4 or 5 mark. For an ordinary 75mm Sherman, it was a crew of 5. You had the driver, co-driver, who also had a 30 caliber Browning to operate, and they were down in the hull. They each had a hatch to get out, though again had to be a little bit careful where the gun barrel was, because potentially it could block their route out. Most models of Sherman also had a hatch on the bottom that you could escape that way, but that, in the moments before the tank explodes, it's hard to remember all of this. Then in the turret you have the gunner and the loader wireless operator, and then the commander. Americans, of course, are left-hand drive folk, unlike we Brits. So unlike Cromwell or a Churchill, the driver was on the left. And the whole thing, the way the crews arranged is flipped to the side of a British-made tank. The British did manufacture their tanks. They made the Cromwell, they made the Churchill, that were the main ones in use in Normandy. However, there were fewer of these than there were American-supplied tanks in the Lend-Lease system, and the vast majority of British tank crews in Normandy were in Sherman tanks, and that was partly the reason I decided to put James in a Sherman, but also it's my way of sort of including that sense of the whole Allied cause. I couldn't really have American characters featuring, because the two armies effectively, occasionally they joined up, and there were actions that were fought where the British met the Americans, but on the whole that didn't happen. That was a rarity, and you didn't tend to put your major offensives where the join was, because that's not the way military planners work. It's not the strong point of any force, whether it's the joints between divisions, the joints between corps, the joints between armies. You tend to avoid them. You tend to want to concentrate your force more in the middle. So tens of thousands of Sherman tanks were made, dwarfing the production of German armour during the war. There weren't quite as many Shermans as there were T-34s, but it's getting close. They're the next most common tank manufactured during the 1939-45 period. And they are lots of different marks of it, but essentially it's the same tank, the gun, the protection of the basic 75mm Sherman that had first seen action at El Alamein, used by the British, and is still the same as the one that you see in Normandy. Now the Sherman has this 75mm gun as its main armament. It is built very much to fit the needs of America as a nation of war that's gearing up from having had a tiny army in the 1930s to building a major one and taking on a big role in a major global conflict from 1941 onwards. So it's designed, they have stopgap measures like the M3, the Lee, the Grant, as the British called it. Again, the name Sherman is given to it by the British. The British were a little confused by the American system of, you had the M3 Stuart, but the light tank, but you also had the M3 medium tank, and then the Sherman was the M4. They chose names of American generals to give to these different vehicles, and eventually many of these got taken on by the Americans as well, though there is an argument. Most people will deny that, certainly officially, the US Army didn't tend to talk much about Shermans during the Second World War, though it did come to do so afterwards. I'm not so sure. It's very hard to tell when you have reminiscences of men who were there. The veterans, they will often talk about fighting and being in Shermans and their strengths, their weaknesses. Are they doing that because that became common afterwards, or were they already doing it at the time because they've seen the newsreels and they've heard about it, in the same way that the Flying Tigers in China copy the shark's tooth painting on the nose of the aircraft from having seen, I think it was Time magazine photographs of RAF squadrons with Tomahawks and Kitty Hawks and the like in the desert. Other versions of the P-40 basically. So they copy that, think, oh, that looks good, so we'll do that as well. Fighting men do, if they think something's good, they'll take it on. So that's an aside really, but the British certainly do. They call it the Sherman, they don't really talk about the M4 to any great extent. There were lots of different models of Sherman, and I've not been too precise with saying which one each the characters are driving at any one time, because on the whole it doesn't really matter. But the vast majority of them, particularly at this stage of the war, were the basic 75mm version. Some were diesel engines, some were petrol engined. Petrol being a type of aviation fuel, because a lot of the engine design is very similar to aircraft engines. The American army, on the whole, didn't like diesel versions, so they tended to send the diesel ones as lend-lease to Russia, to the British, to the Canadians and others. However, they did send petrol versions as well. So a lot of the time in the book, even though the British used more diesel engine versions than they did petrol engine versions, they used the petrol ones as well. So quite often, there are some distinctions, but on the whole, I've put my particular unit in the petrol version. I can't quite remember why. I just made that decision early on and thought, well, let's just be consistent and stick with it. There were different engines because you have different factories producing along different production lines of basically the same thing. Different ways of constructing the hull, the cast, the welded, all of this sort of thing. But essentially, the 75mm Sherman in 1944 is basically the same tank. The variations between how it's actually made, what engine it's got, is fairly slight. Overall performance is pretty much standard, and it's weighing in at just under 30 tons. It's a lot easier to transport, and bear in mind the Americans have got to transport them around the globe. These tanks that are made and manufactured in the United States have to get to Britain for the invasion of Europe. They had to get before that to North Africa to fight there. They had to get to Russia to fight. So you needed something that could be transported by ship and then ideally by rail as well when it got to the other end, which is something that the Germans have great trouble doing with their Panthers and their Tigers and their really big tanks. So you can make far more Shermans. It's a simple design. It's not as advanced. It's not as well protected. It's not as strongly armed as the German equivalents, but you can make lots of them. It's also made in a way, everyone who served with them, worked with them, comments on the reliability. They didn't break down as often, particularly compared to the early war British tanks that broke down a lot. So it was a big relief in the Desert War when they had these, that these were, then in 1942, the Sherman 75 was well armoured, well gunned. By 1944, the Germans have built bigger and bigger types that outclass it in those respects. But you have something that is reliable, that isn't going to break down, that is easy to repair and can be got going and kept going. So if you look at the number of tanks that an armoured unit actually has in working order at any one time in the Allied armies, particularly with the Sherman equipped units of the British and the Americans, there's far more of them that are actually working that you've got. And compared to the Germans, where there's usually quite a few of them that are in the repair shop. Not helped by the fact that with German industry struggling because of the strategic bombing campaign, they're not making as many spare parts. And German doctrine is a little bit different as to how they deal with damaged and broken down vehicles. Something that will be true by the middle and later stages of the Battle for Normandy is that the Allies have huge reserves of Sherman tanks, so when they are knocked out, they are very quickly replaced. And it's crew losses that matter more. You can replace those, but you can replace the vehicle even easier. Whilst that's taken for granted, and it is true more broadly, it wasn't true of the first few weeks of the Normandy campaign. And you do find then that quite a lot of units are operating under strength because of the attrition of combat. And that's something I tried to bring into the novel, that you're having to take charge of improvised troops and all this sort of thing. So that's one of those things that develops as the war goes on. But overall, the pattern is that the American factories can churn out huge numbers of Shermans. They can churn out huge numbers of replacement engines, spare parts and other things, keep them going. So even though the tank itself is under-armoured compared to German equivalents and severely undergunned for tank-to-tank combat, then it is still a very viable and effective weapon. And overall, there is the Stalin's comment of quantity has a quality of its own, which is a bit rough if you're the person in the quantity. Allied tank crews perceive their tanks as vulnerable to the German ones. They feel that they are outclassed by German armour. And it's right. You can't blame them. They can get knocked out at far longer ranges than they can knock out the enemy. However, going back to what we started off with, tank-to-tank combat most of the time is fairly rare. It just doesn't happen to be in the British-Canadian sector of Normandy for much of the campaign. When you're fighting against dug-in German infantry and you're trying to shoot in your own infantry as they're attacking, actually the Sherman is very good at that. And the Sherman 75mm round is very effective, in some ways better than some of the German guns that have higher tank busting power, but they're less good as infantry support weapons. The Sherman really was designed as infantry support. It goes back to this US Army doctrine that tanks were there to exploit, to fight against enemy guns, enemy infantry, and that you had tank destroyers who would take out the enemy armour. This wasn't a tank designed with the doctrine of it's going to be fighting German tanks. So you can't entirely blame the designers, and the virtues of the Sherman make it very important, very significant. It does allow the Western Allies to win the war in Northwest Europe. Without it, they couldn't have done it. If they'd had far fewer but bigger tanks, it would have taken a lot longer. So, up until just before D-Day, British Army tank troops are 3 tanks. And it's, again, as I said, officer, sergeant, corporal in charge of each one. All of them have radio transmitters as well as receivers, so they can talk to each other. In the US Army, they tend to have transmitters only in the officers and the sergeant's tank, and in the rest of the platoon of 5, the others just had receivers. The idea was that if you had too many people broadcasting, transmitting at the same time, it would simply be confusing. So you need your commanders to tell the rest what to do. Like a lot of doctrines that are nice in theory, experience taught many armoured units that this wasn't such a great idea, and they'd start to forage transmitter radios so that they could put more of the platoon able to talk to each other and report, because obviously if they spot a threat, then they want to be able to tell everybody quickly. So as the war in Northwest Europe went on, more and more, particularly the experienced units, ended up with everybody in the platoon of 5 Shermans being able to talk to each other and not just hear. The British doctrine was that way from the beginning. It had been like that since certainly the early stages of the Desert War. Not all armies did that. The French, the Italians, the Russians early on didn't have intercoms within the vehicle and communicated by flags and signals and hand gestures, which obviously didn't work terribly well. The Germans from the start had good communication in all their vehicles. It was one of the major advantages of the panzer units from the start of the war. You've also got a situation where when the first M3s, the Stuart light tanks, or the Honey as the British dubbed them, arrived in the Western Desert, at that point they didn't have an internal intercom, so that the crew can talk to each other as well. Again, standard in German tanks from the start, and the British adopted it. They decided this was very important. You relied on shouting, you'd relied on, the Russians did this, the Americans did. I think there's a, I can't remember what it's called, there's a Bob Hope comedy where he's in the army, and I think it's before America came into the war. It's sort of in that build up to mobilization earlier in 41, where he's the driver of a light tank and the commander's got his feet on Bob Hope's shoulders and he's sort of pushing for left to go left, pushing for right to go right, and I think they pick up a girl hitchhiker or something like that. And that's this being a Bob Hope comedy, and he suddenly feels back and there's definitely not a booted foot on his shoulder, but something rather more delicate. It's a comedy, that's an exaggeration, but actually that's essentially how people were doing things early on. And the British had discovered, the Germans had realised from earlier on, this is not effective. The best way is if your tank crew is working as an extremely close team so they can talk to each other all the time. So that's something, that's standard, and that's also true. In an American Sherman, the crew itself can talk to each other even if they don't have a transmitter for the rest of the unit in the early stages. Now that's obviously a great advantage from a novelist's point of view, just as a digression, in that because the crew can talk to each other, you end up with chances for conversation, for dialogue that would not be plausible in the circumstances of an infantry section in the middle of a firefight. Tank crew is still talking to each other, that's the whole point. And that's very, very useful from a narrative point of view. But also it's it's true. So I've tried to reflect that chatter and the moments where they're hanging around and waiting, where they are just chatting to stop themselves worrying too much, trying to sort of, keep things. Is it better to be silent or is it better to talk? That's one of the dilemmas faced by a tank commander. It meant that tank crews were very close-knit groups, similarly like the crews of bombers, where again you're talking to each other over the intercom, and you're spending this time locked in this machine. You are a component of that machine. You have to all work together to operate it. The training system in the British Army was very much to emphasise the role when you gave an order or when you reported. So it would be driver advance, gunner, give the target information, guide it on, what's around you're firing, loader, do this, all of these sorts of things. Rather than saying the name, the idea being that if somebody was killed or wounded, crews were shifted around, replacements came in. It was always absolutely clear in these moments of crisis who was speaking to whom and what you wanted them to do. So you have this close-knit group, and I've tried to reflect that in the dialogue in the story of the jokes, the chatter, the griping, moaning at each other, the banter, the insults, but also in the action itself, where you're getting reports in, and on the intercom you're hearing these instructions. So even if you're not the tank commander who's actually doing on the main net, he's switching between the two, whether he can transmit to the rest of the troop, the rest of the squadron, the rest of the regiment, or he can talk directly to his crew. And there were cases where people get the switch wrong and they say something rather indiscreet that was meant for their crew and gets broadcast to the whole squadron. And that again happens a few times in the story to get that sense. And sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's embarrassing. But it meant that tank crews had an awareness of the wider action that was not granted to infantrymen. Most infantrymen don't know what's going on. Most platoons, the British Army by this time had decided not to have a radio in platoon headquarters because it meant that company and higher commanders tried to control the platoons too much, and they felt it was. So generally speaking, the radio communication is at company level, with exceptions. You might have an artillery forward observation officer, a FOO or something like that with you, but again, different thing. We'll talk about that when we get to talk about the other characters and their roles as infantry platoon commander, as Bren gunner in a rifle section, when we look at Mark and Bill Judd respectively. So anyway, back to the Sherman tank troop of 1944. As I say, up until then, tank troop was always 3. By the build-up to the Normandy landing, from experience in North Africa, Tunisia and Sicily and Italy, the Allies have become aware that the Germans have got bigger tanks with bigger guns, and that the Sherman 75 cannot knock these out at normal battlefield ranges unless it's very lucky, unless the enemy expose their weaker side armour, this sort of thing. But it can't, as a matter of course, expect to take on the Tigers and the Panthers. It can sometimes struggle with some of the Stugs and the armoured personnel gun. The SPs and as well as even the Panzer IV. The Panzer IV had begun at the start of the war with a short, low-velocity 75mm gun, and it's got an increasingly longer-barrelled, higher-velocity one as things have gone on. And also you've got these very powerful German anti-tank guns. The 50mm gun that had anti-tank gun, the Pak-38, that had dominated the Desert War, obviously backed by things like the 88, has now been replaced as standard by the Pak-40, which is a high-velocity 75mm gun that can penetrate a Sherman's armour easily. The British have up-armoured the Churchill tank, trying to get an infantry tank that's a bit better protected, though again it's still vulnerable. The Cromwell and the Sherman, they're thinking, well, we need something to give these units greater punch, and they come out with the Sherman Firefly. And it's an interesting example in a sort of broader sense of how the Western Allies cooperate in a way that, say, the Germans and Japanese don't really. Because here you take an American tank and the British adapt their 17-pounder anti-tank gun, normally a wheeled anti-tank gun, a huge great thing, and they manage, by partly sort of turning it on its side or almost upside down, they manage to cram it into an enlarged turret of a Sherman tank. They have to add a big counterweight on the back of the turret. That's after extending in the first place, so you've still got room for the wireless. But another counterweight, because you've got this dirty great gun barrel stretching out in front to balance that up and make sure that the vehicle can still move. You get rid of the co-driver altogether because you need the space inside, not least because these 17-pounder rounds are significantly larger, longer, and a little bit heavier than the ones of the 75mm gun. So to have a viable amount of ammunition, you need space. So you get rid of the co-driver, who is, in a sense, an optional extra, but that also means you lose the whole machine gun. So all you've got is the coaxial, the machine gun that's fitted next to the main gun barrel. This is issued to units in the weeks and months before D-Day. There are cases where units had not had much chance to test fire them. 17-pounder has a much longer range. Its armoured piercing ability is comparable to the very powerful 75mm gun on the German Panther tank, even the 88mm on the Tiger. This is a very, very good, very powerful gun. Disadvantages are there's a dirty great muzzle flash when it fires, and you had to be taught to blink, to close your eyes a second or so before it went off, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see anything for some time afterwards. The other thing, of course, a big muzzle flash does is shout out to the world, here I am, shoot back at me. So it stands out from its smaller brethren of the ordinary 75mm Shermans. And they didn't equip whole units with this. They issued them at a ratio of about sort of 25% of a unit would be Fireflies. So you have a Sherman with a much bigger gun. At the same time, the Americans have brought in a 76mm gun version of the Sherman. But although this arrived in Britain before D-Day, a conscious decision was made. After trials, they thought the muzzle flash was too much of a giveaway and that its high explosive round wasn't any more effective, if as good, as that of the 75mm Sherman. So the US Army did not issue these to armoured units. They didn't want them until in the latter stages of the Normandy campaign, when they have had some tank-to-tank encounters and they think actually we need something with a bit more punch to take on the German vehicles. And then they start to, when they become more and more common the rest of the war in Western Europe. But again, it's a sign of your expectation of how your tanks are going to be fighting, that you actually decide, I don't want the bigger gun, because for most of the things I'm doing, what I've got is actually ideal already, so let's not change things. The British have brought this in. They've brought it in as a proportion of units. There is no official doctrine at the start as to how these are to be used. So they're issued to the different regiments, and in some cases they basically form, they usually get 3 per squadron, they form another troop that's all Fireflies. And the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry do this. I think the Dragoon Guards of 8th Armoured Brigade do this. 24th Lancers quite probably did as well. I wasn't able to find out for certain how they did things. My unit does not. My unit follows the practice that was already in place with the regiments of the armoured divisions, like 11th Armoured, and was mirrored by 7th Armoured Division, which, although it had Cromwell's as its main gun tank, it had a Firefly in each troop. So you basically created, instead of a troop of 3, you added a Firefly to it to create a troop of 4. And there would eventually be a 17-pounder sort of up-gun version of the Cromwell, called the Challenger, sort of extended, lengthened chassis thing that was never entirely satisfactory, that was issued to 7th Armoured and the units with Cromwells. But in the early stages they used Sherman Fireflies, which did stand out, did have different spare parts, all that sort of thing, but nevertheless they worked and they were available. So in the case of James's troop, he has a troop of 4 tanks when it's at full strength, the 3 ordinary Shermans with a Firefly that's also, as it was usually the case, commanded by a sergeant. The Canadians, some of their units experimented with giving the Firefly to the troop commander, and in some units you had, because you've got these 3 extra tanks, you had 5 troops of 3 tanks in a squadron plus the HQ. The longer term, everybody would go to troops of 4, and you'd have 4 troops of 4 tanks, 16 plus the command unit. Again, depending on availability, the number of Fireflies that were around. It didn't work. Having the Fireflies concentrated into one troop, no one was quite sure how to use them. They tended not to be in the right place at the right time when you needed that punch against heavier German armour. And in some cases there was criticism. They were basically the sort of squadron commander or the squadron second in command had them as a bodyguard going around with him. The Canadians discovered that if you put the commander in the Firefly, he had too many things to do, because he's trying to direct the whole troop, and he's also got to command that tank and use the most powerful gun in his arsenal when it comes to anti-tank capability. So it's the system that pretty much everybody used eventually was the troop of 4, with one of them a Firefly that was commanded by a sergeant, and the officer in a gun tank, ordinary 75mm. So that's James's role, and that's what he gets. In this particular, in the bit I read out right back at the start, however many years and hours ago that was, he's actually taken over the Firefly because his own tank has been incapacitated, and he has some doubts about the aggression of the sergeant in charge of the Firefly. So as this man arrives, he takes over that tank and goes to the other two, the sergeant and the troop corporal. I have simplified and standardized the system of call signs, though it's based on essentially the system that was in use. There'd been some variations earlier in the war, but by Normandy it was fairly standard. So you would have, first of all, your squadron. So, you know, Able for A Squadron, Baker for B Squadron, Charlie for the C Squadron. That's the simplest way of doing it. In reality, call signs would tend to change day in, day out. The idea being to confuse the enemy. Rather like I remember being taught a thing called Batco when I was in the OTC at Oxford, and I always felt it was to confuse the British Army more than it was to confuse anybody eavesdropping on them. But nevertheless, it was this way of disguising your messages. That's the theory. Many units tended to standardise, others simply, and often it's particularly noticeable with veteran units, and this applies in any army, that sometimes get sloppy. Think, well, we can do everything and we'll just do it our way, and we'll even use names and things like that. But the idea was you'd have a word for the squadron, you'd then have a number for the troop. So James is normally Baker 3, he's the 3rd troop of B Squadron, and then you would have James himself as the commander of the troop is Baker 3. The sergeant is Baker 3 Able, sometimes just 3 Able. The troop corporal is Baker 3 Baker. I mean, it's confusing because you've got 2 Bakers in this case, but I thought, let's keep it simple, let's stick with something, and then if you repeat it often enough, hopefully even readers who are not inclined to take an interest in this sort of stuff will know what's going on, know who's what. And then you have the Firefly as an addition becomes the C tank, the Charlie tank, so it's Baker 3 Charlie. So in each case you could say, by announcing who you are and to whom you're talking, you're using those call signs. As I say, I kept them the same all the way through the story rather than changing with different operations, different days, for the sake of clarity. And hopefully it always is. It does mean a lot of repetition, and because I've given the squadron the name Baker, perhaps if I'd called them Roger or something like that, it would have been a bit simpler. Again, I've tried to reflect the proper transmission, the methods, as well as I can. People did vary it a bit. I've simplified things to try and give a flavour of it whilst making it intelligible. But the whole point was control. This unit was to fight as a group. You have the squadron, you have the troops. When you had all 3 squadrons together, as you sometimes have in the book, that's 60 call signs, 60 stations as they'd call them, different radio transmitters or so, around about that number. It could get very confusing. There were times when it was hard for people to get their information across because the lines were being blocked by people chattering away. That was one of those problems they never quite dealt with, but later on they're not fighting in such, with the regiment concentrated so often in one small area. It tends to be more squadron and troop actions. In the wider Northwest Europe campaign, encounters between even a squadron of tanks on each side are relatively rare. It tends to be troop against troop, or smaller, simply because the landscape doesn't allow you to see that sort of thing. But in some of the time in Normandy you did get these bigger encounters, and you certainly get lots of German and Allied tanks in a very small area. On quite a few occasions in the sectors where our characters are fighting. So you'll have the officer who can transmit to his own crew but also to his own troop and then to the squadron. At times James will end up commanding what's left of the squadron and giving him a different perspective on what's going on and allowing us to explain that. So it's trying to show this war where it's very controlled, there's a lot of communication, you're finding out what's going on, but also that means you're finding out about the bad stuff as well. So you are hearing the crews sometimes as they scream out that they're hit. Sometimes worse, you're hearing them scream when the tank starts to burn quickly. Sherman tanks were notorious at the time for the speed and ease with which they caught fire. The crews thought this was to do with the engines, particularly the petrol engines and the ammunition. Later on, studies in the war concluded it was actually really the ammunition that went off so quickly and made them so combustible. You know, you have the British nickname for them was Ronsons, after the Ronsons lighters that lit first time. Germans calling them Tommy Cookers, this sort of thing. Get a little bit of that in the book, though not obviously. We don't hear anything. We don't see things from the German point of view because it's not that sort of story. they do seem to have burned quicker, particularly than the German tanks, but on the other hand, sometimes the German tanks did burn and they did explode, and you get those cases as we had in the bit where I read the passage, where the ammunition goes off so quickly that the turret is ripped off and flung into the air. Obviously appalling consequences for anybody inside. Normally when a Sherman was hit, the crew felt they had a matter of seconds to get out before it started burning. They didn't always burn, but they did often. On average, 1 or 2 crewmen are killed or badly wounded each time a Sherman is knocked out. So sometimes the whole crew goes, sometimes 1 or 2, sometimes you're lucky and everybody gets out. But it depends where the tanks hit. Bear in mind as well, most movies tend to have every shell that's fired from any gun in any period explodes. Whether it's, if it's a cannonball at Waterloo or something like that. In fact, you have the 2 basic types of ammunition. There are variations, but there's armoured piercing and high explosive. The high explosive goes bang, as we talked about earlier. That's to do with blast and shrapnel. But the armoured piercing is solid. It is almost like a cannonball in the old days, and the idea is it goes very hard, very fast, slams into the armour of an enemy tank, either breaks through, sometimes it can penetrate altogether if the armour's thin enough and the shell's powerful enough, going with enough momentum, or if not, can splatter from inside. It can start spreading bits of the metal of the tank itself that fly around very hot, very fast, scything through what's ever inside there, killing, maiming people, setting off ammunition, setting off fuel, this sort of thing. So it's solid shot. You're mainly firing at enemy tanks, although some British units did develop the technique that if you fired high explosives at German tanks that you couldn't penetrate with your armoured piercing shell, that it frightened them off. And even in some cases, actually, the debris, the smoke from the shell got sucked into the air intakes and the crew abandoned. But there was a lot of luck involved. You have as well the Panther tank. The earlier models, they changed this slightly later, had a rounded mantlet around the gun, whereby if you had a really good gunner, he could hit the bottom part of it, it would deflect the shell down into the thinner armour above the driver and co-driver's head and destroy the tank that way. It was done, people were able to do it, but it took a steady nerve and you had to get pretty close to be that accurate, and what are the Germans doing while you're doing this? So this is a story where our British tankers and James and his crews are coming up quite often against bigger and heavier tanks than them. They've got the Firefly, but also the Firefly is big and obvious with this immense gun barrel on it that makes it look different to the other Shermans, with this huge muzzle flash when it fires. It's obviously, if you're a German gunner or tank commander, you're thinking, well, that's the one I'm going to take out first. So it's vulnerable. In later stages of the campaign, they tried with paint schemes, sometimes with adding a false muzzle brake half the way along the barrel, trying to disguise the fact that you were the Charlie tank, the Firefly. But you are facing this. But there are plenty of occasions in Normandy as well. The Germans lost a lot of tanks whenever they counterattacked, whenever they came into the open. And tank fighting is about gunpowder and armour and all these things. But in a sense, like air fighting, like a lot of battle, it's more about, can you see your enemy before he sees you? And many of the deadly encounters, when you knock out several tanks, are when you see them before they've realised you're there, before they've established your position, and if possible, they'll get cases where James tries to manoeuvre his tanks so they can shoot at the Germans from the side where their armour's weaker, or if you're in an ambush position where they've very helpfully come along and they're crossing your position so you can do that, you can knock them out. Panthers, even Tigers, the big tanks did get knocked out when they came into the open. In Normandy, they're often waiting for you and you're coming around a corner and you're seeing them at short ranges where you can't, your shells are going to still bounce off, but theirs definitely aren't going to bounce off with you. The nature of the terrain in Normandy, particularly the close country, the bocage, was a disadvantage for the German tanks and their big guns, because although it meant sudden encounters were still likely to go their way, they could not pick the Allies off at very long range as they could, for instance, on the Russian steppes, where you could be picking off the enemy at a mile or more's range. There are some areas, some of the land around Hill 112, some of the bits of Normandy as they try to break out of the open country where they could do that. So there are advantages and disadvantages to each side of the type of country that they're in. Generally speaking, Normandy favours the defender, particularly in armoured conflict, but it's still not perfect for them either. So James's war is about control, it's about communication, it's about, from his point of view, trying to think and outthink the enemy, trying to position not just his own vehicle but the others, but he's also commanding his own tank that's fighting effectively as well. And this is the strain that will grow on him, that he's making these decisions all the time, and then he's hearing the consequences and seeing the consequences. And you can see the tanks that are blown up very quickly, or that burn, where you know that there are people you know and know well still inside them being burned to death quite slowly in some cases. You see that, and there's, when you see the Shermans with the big holes in their side, where you see the insides of them spattered with blood from where people have been killed, and you're thinking, well, that could easily be me. My tank is exactly like those, and look how easily that was destroyed, look how easily that was burned. They do learn as they go along. This is a story about trying to reflect the experience where a lot of the things you've been trained to do don't necessarily work out. And you have the basic dilemma as a tank commander, from something we will often forget if we're not used to these sorts of things, but a tank is a big steel box. And whereas in your car you've got a nice windscreen at the back, you've got mirrors, you've got a central mirror to see behind you, the driver of a tank can't see very much at all. He has to be directed by somebody. Now often people like James and other tank commanders had to dismount to guide the driver in to get them into a proper position, particularly if they were trying to go hull down or into an ambush position. He's got to go and check that the ground is solid enough, that the view they'll get when they end up there is also what they want. So he's at risk to mortar fire, to snipers, to all of these things, because he's outside the shelter of the tank that normally is pretty safe from those things. But the problem is, a tank is a big steel box, and you have a cupola with vision blocks where you can look out, and you can rotate this around the top of your turret hatch. Without sticking your head out, you can see around you, but that vision is always going to be narrow. And the gunner has also got a telescopic sight with his gun, but it's, whilst he can enlarge things, it is still narrow. It's whatever way the turret is pointing he's looking at. In the Western Desert, tank commanders had tended to stand tall so that they could see very far, and their most vital thing then, and it would still be the case in Normandy, the most vital piece of equipment was their binoculars. They had to see a long way, they had to spot the enemy, they had to guide, first of all, the troop, squadron, whatever it was, into position, and then guide their gunner to hit the enemy and avoid threats from the enemy to move position when you're becoming vulnerable. So a lot of people were trained and were thought this was the doctrine of the Royal Armoured Corps very much at that time. As a commander, you have to see what's going on, therefore you fight the battle with your hatches open, with your head out, possibly quite a bit of your body out. That's great in the desert, where the chances of infantry coming up and shooting at you, sniping at you, are fairly slim. They can't get close without being seen. In Northwest Europe, this is simply an utterly different world, where the enemy can be hiding anywhere very close. So if you're sticking your head out of your turret, then it's vulnerable. You can be shot. And a lot of commanders are killed that way. They can sometimes be hit by shrapnel from mortar bombs, shells, this sort of thing, but they can be shot by snipers as well, or by small arms fire, because they are trying to do their job and see as much. You need that awareness of the situation. You need to know what's going on around you. So you're looking out, you're watching, but while you're doing that, you are vulnerable. So you will see they had to try and find a compromise, in the same way that there was a helmet tankers were given, but most found it uncomfortable, didn't like it, so they ditch it for a beret, particularly with the headphones over the top. But again, that gives you some protection, but it means your head is harder to move, you get tired, it's uncomfortable, you're maybe less sensitive than you would be otherwise. They tend to go for berets rather than the helmets, but again, it's an individual choice. And then the compromise is, how much do you poke above the head? So you will see on a lot of pictures, the commander is sort of just peering above the cupola, trying to expose as little of himself as possible, but he still needs to see. And in circumstances whenever they feel safe, when there isn't the risk of small arms fire, they will stick out even more than that, because you need to see, and you need to guide your driver when you're going backwards. But in a combat situation, you are looking. So all the time he's making these personal decisions of, how much do I look out, how far do I expose myself, because I need to see, but then I don't want to die. If I'm killed, that's no use to anybody, but also if I get killed because I'm not looking out, so I'm not seeing the threats in time, then that's no good for us either. So the pressure is on the commander. Commanders suffer a higher rate of casualties than anybody else, and that's regardless of rank, whether they're an officer, a sergeant or a corporal, because they need to expose themselves these ways, because they need to dismount more often to find the way through, guide the driver on. and in many cases to be summoned out for O groups and conferences and this sort of thing as well. So they have to do that, but if they don't do that, the whole tank and its whole crew is vulnerable. So I've tried to reflect the personal element, what it felt like, what it smelt like, how uncomfortable it was, how you relieve yourself when you need to, of living in a tank in wartime and on campaign, and then go on and try to explain the fighting, what you're doing, whether you're fighting against, you're supporting an infantry attack and you're not dealing with enemy armour, when you are dealing with enemy armour, when you're dealing with both, how all these different challenges don't have a simple, easy answer. You have to try and compromise and find a way that works. And luck plays a part at every stage, because if the enemy sees you before you see him, then he can knock you out. If his gunner is a little bit faster or a little bit better in his aim than you are, then you're in trouble. There can be the flukes. Tanks can be hit and brew up, explode immediately, particularly Shermans, but also they cannot. You can survive a hit. Sometimes the tanks will still function. Sometimes you'll have time to get out. All the things that are completely beyond your control, as well as the things you're trying to do to control. That's really the theme of the story, is the randomness of it, but the element of how you're trying to adapt to live in this and do your job and cope, and the reliance on those around you that is particularly strong in a tank crew, because that group of 5 is so close together all the time, and they get to know each other. Most people say their crew knew them better than anybody else, and you have more than one officer will talk about learning about life lessons, because sometimes he'd be 19, James is not quite 21 in the story. They haven't experienced a lot of life in many cases, and they might be commanding men several years older than them, sometimes even more mature than that, and with a broader experience of the wider world than the often sheltered upbringing of a middle-class youngster like the ones I'm dealing with, who's been to private school in a small town, and then in James's case on to boarding school. Then there's the war and you're straight into the army. That's all you've really known. And he's quite a sensitive soul. So trying to bring all that together, that was the aim of the story. That's what I hope I've done. And those are some of the things that interested me. So I thought, that's some of the background. That's a sense of James's war. And next time maybe we'll look at, not sure whether we'll do Bill or we'll do Mark next time, and we might look at, I think in more detail, I'll probably look at the tanks and the AFVs at some point as well, because that's a nice thing for pictures and illustrations. But anyway, that's it for today. Hill 112, James's War. Thanks for watching.